Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob. Bob Kincaid, welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday. It is the 6th day of January. It is the third consecutive day that we've been able to present a live program here on the Head On Radio Network. As you know, this is our final broadcast this week. After today, we will not be back until next Monday. It is a pleasure to be with you once again, and I welcome you to our program. I want to share with you, as I do every day at the beginning, a request or a request for you to feel very, very comfortable calling into the program and sharing your thoughts and your ideas with all of our listeners. Again, the more we do that, it seems to me the better program we have. I remember last Wednesday, you'll recall that Horst called in, and John called in, and we had a couple of callers the same day, and it seems to me the quality of those programs is just so superior to those when it becomes a monologue. And again, many of the things, in fact, today, for example, a couple of things that I've got to share with you, I feel very excited about, and I can usually get pretty excited about the program, but the fact of the matter is the more back and forth we have, the better the quality of the program. We do have a phone number, and it'll get you on the air. Our number is 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. And again, you realize that 4676 translates on your keypad into HORN, H-O-R-N. So if this is a way that is easier for you to remember the phone number, then by all means do that. It's 304-663-HORN. If you would like to communicate with me one-on-one via email, if you're a little bit reluctant or uncomfortable about going on the air, and I can fully understand that, then please feel free to send me an email. I would love to hear from you, and I'll do the very, very best I can. At minimum, I'll acknowledge a receipt and thank you for your email, for taking the time to send it. And if it's something that I can respond substantively to, I'll try to make an effort to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N 906. That's all one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. And again, I call your attention to our Facebook page. We've had it now for about 4 months, and about that, I'm not really sure exactly when it began. But I continue to try to remember to put more and more on it. Last evening, for example, I put an item on it related to the 15 conservative items, data, some of the data that was collected in the article that we began in yesterday's program about the 15 items that, in theory, according to the author of the article, would pretty much refute what was called the liberal narratives on many of these issues. And we started in our program yesterday, for better than the last half of the program, we started to go through these particular items, and where I was able to make a comment on them, I did. And we got through 4 or 5, I believe, in yesterday's program. Anyway, last evening on Facebook, I posted the very first one, which was on the issue of terrorism in America and the extent to which the allegations are that all of the terrorism, for all practical purposes, is generated by Muslims. And I looked at some of the data, and of course the implication of the data was that if you look at the percentage of Muslims in this country, which is less than 1%, and then you look at the reality that half of the terrorist attacks in this country are perpetrated by Muslims, then the conclusion to that is, on the part of the author, whose name is Krikorian, that that meant that Muslims are 5,000 times more likely to be involved in terrorism than any other group. And of course, I took issue with that, and I wrote on Facebook yesterday that indeed I had taken issue with that. And let me I'm going through my papers here, and here it is. This is what I put on Facebook yesterday, and the reason I'm going back to this particular item is because one of our listeners, Horst, commented on it quite extensively, and I wanted to share that comment as well because I think it's extremely pertinent to the issue. Here's the quote. Muslims account for only about 1% of the U.S. population, but account for about half of terrorist attacks since 9/11. That means Muslims in the United States are about 5,000% more likely to commit terrorist acts than non-Muslims. That's the quote, and the author is Mark Krikorian. And I pointed out that this is the lead to the lead item in a 15-item conservative-generated indictment that the author, John Hawkins, believes will destroy liberal narratives. And this is what I commented on it, about what I said, and it's pretty much a compilation of what I said on the air yesterday. So this is clearly in the venue of summary or review. I've said, on the contrary, the quote above makes clear a political agenda that seeks to inflame a worldwide struggle between the Muslim world and the West, i.e. Christianity. This is, of course, the scenario that President Obama is trying so hard to discourage, to make certain that radical extremists operating in the name of Islam remain isolated from mainstream Muslims throughout the world. His strategies only help when moderate Muslims step up and take a position against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other extremist groups. Of particular interest in assessing the data above, I've said, is focus upon the definition of terrorism. It appears we have to realize that any act of violence in today's world is defined as terrorism when it's perpetrated by a Muslim. Other violent acts committed by anyone but Muslims seems able to avoid the sting of the terrorist label. These are usually attributed to rebellious acts of the unbalanced, rogue behavior of deranged individuals, most often unrelated to any organized group. When's the last time we heard about an act attributed to a Christian or a Jewish terrorist? That African American residents of America's cities are frightened by the degree of violence employed by rogue cops seems never to acquire the label of terrorism, when in fact that's exactly what it is. The murder of Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Laquan McDonald in Chicago, and like examples of urban violence visited upon African American males seems never to acquire the label of terrorism. Likewise, for the seizure of a federal building in Oregon by opponents of an alleged federal government overreach. Please explain the theory that would cause ownership of federal lands to revert, not to the commons, but to those who live in the immediate neighborhood. Kind of property rights on steroids, it seems. At least that was my comment. But I digress. To limit terrorism to acts only of Muslims is to ensure the lopsided numbers in the data presented. Rather than making the case intended, the presentation of data like this only highlights the warped political agenda of those eager to legitimize a strategy designed to pin the terrorist label on all those who practice one of the world's great religions. It is to risk the proverbial clash of civilizations by pitting the two principal world religions against each other. It is also to assert a non sequitur. If only 1% of the population is Muslim, and if half of all terrorist acts are committed by Muslims, then, conclusion, Muslims are 5,000 times more likely to commit acts of terrorism. Being a Muslim, this argument goes, makes one a likely terrorist based on these numbers. I don't think so. That dog don't hunt, as they say. Here's where the need for a quality education becomes so important. All of our people need to be able to see through these deceptive strategies. They're dangerous. And that's kind of what I put on the Facebook page last evening. And one of our listeners, Horst, responded to it this morning, and I thought the response was quite good, and I wanted to share it with you. So here goes. He writes, I'd add a further question as to where these terrorist acts are committed. The argument as framed would have the reader believe that these are all terrorist acts committed within the United States. But given the way some of the people quoted in this article, Ann Coulter, Ross Douthat, etc., have been known to operate, I'm tempted to suspect that they're counting all acts of terror committed worldwide and then dividing that up by the number of American Muslims. It'd be dishonest beyond measure, but unfortunately not unprecedented with this crowd. If there are links to source materials, I'd like to see them. The thing is, if you limit the scope of your inquiry to U.S. attacks, there isn't a whole lot to work with, especially, as I pointed out, as you point out, given how little of what we might consider worthy of the label terrorism is officially declared to be such. Police brutality, I'm glad you brought it up, will never be called terrorism despite the very calculated effect that it has of placing entire populations of distinct ethnic groups in a state of unremitting terror. Because the police cannot, in our national mythology themselves, be criminals of any sort. Blatant acts of terror against non-white, non-Christian targets are also, again as you point out, rarely if ever tagged as terrorism. Abortion clinic bombings, racist or Nazi-themed vandalism, attacks on attacks on and countless threats of violence against Planned Parenthood facilities, even public incitement for such behavior over the public airwaves and cable TV. None of these are considered terrorism, despite their clearly intimidating effects. And that's assuming they're considered illegal in the first place. And who's burning down all those black churches in the South? Seems like the authorities aren't even willing to call these deliberate acts at all. Sadly, the audience for which articles like this are intended is not interested in the facts or how they may be manipulated to make the case. They simply want to be told they're right, not to be shown why they might be wrong. And I think, Horst mentions the Planned Parenthood facilities. He mentions abortion clinic bombings. He mentions Nazi-themed vandalism, the kinds of things that happen over the airwaves and public TV and all the rest of it. So I really do believe that this is a critical issue. So in that particular item of our list of 15, that very first item, it seems to me very significant that the effort of the author is not to present research. Rather, it's to manipulate research in such a way to make a highly charged political point. And if people are captivated by the data, captivated by numbers, and I've mentioned before, and I'll say it again, that numbers do strengthen the substance of any argument. If you can bring quantitative data to the fore, and you're arguing a point of view, and you can include numbers in it, they seem to carry a weight which exceeds the weight of words. There's no question. I know in classes that I've taught, I used to mention this to students all the time who were writing papers or analytical papers to be submitted to me. And my argument is, if you can include hard data, numbers, it makes your conclusions so much stronger, so much more difficult to refute on the part of many people. And as we know, you can kind of make numbers say what you want them to say. Just talk to any accountant and or a person who fills out income taxes, and I think you'll know what you mean. You can basically make numbers say whatever you want them to say. So, again, that was the item that I put on Facebook, and it dealt only with the first item that we dealt with on yesterday's program. And you'll recall that we dealt with a number of others. We got 4 or 5. We got about a third of the way through the list of 15 that really comprises this particular article by John Hawkins. I picked it up on Facebook. Somebody had posted the link, and I checked it out. Indeed, I thought this list of 15 items would be very, very beneficial to address here on the Virtual Center, because I think, for one thing, it suggests the political nature of the world we're in. How the two sides seem to be arguing a particular ideological point of view, and they're more than willing to use hard data to make their point. You'll recall that in yesterday's program, the second item we dealt with the issue of race. And the conclusion of the article, there's quite a bit of data in here about the decline of the Ku Klux Klan in membership, the virtual disappearance of the Black Panthers, the election of black politicians throughout the country, obviously the President of the United States being the most prominent one, the extent to which President Obama's support of whites in recent elections was quite consistent with the support received by previous Democratic candidates, all of whom were white. And the idea that the public attitudes on interracial marriage, and the data presented is in 1958, only 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. By 2013, that number had gone from 4% up to 87%. So basically, the general conclusion based on this data that the author reached, the author being Greg Jones, was that America might be a lot of things, but being racist isn't one of them. In other words, the clear conclusion that the author is trying to develop here is that by presenting this particular data, he wants to argue that you can basically make the case that racism has become a non-entity in American society because of the decline in membership of the Klan and other things. And I think there's so many things that are happening in our society that refute that conclusion almost totally. The violence in our cities, and on and on and on we go, it seems to me. Many of our school systems have become segregated once again. The emergence of private schools and charter schools in order to give those who don't want to go to integrated schools an opportunity to go to private school based obviously on the ability to pay, and on and on and on. The extent to which the quality of education offered in many of our inner city schools has declined to the point that even though the number of people who are receiving high school diplomas has increased, it seems that the general conclusion is that these high school degrees, in terms of the extent to which they measure quality of education, leave a lot to be desired. And then the third item we dealt with, and in fact, as you recall, it seems to me there are 2 or 3 items in this list that deal with the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, which is clearly the conservatives' main whipping boy over the last couple of years, especially since that particular program was approved and held to be constitutional by the Supreme Court. And the argument, you'll recall, is that 55% of doctors are refusing to receive new Medicaid patients, whereas those who are willing to take private insurance patients are greater than that by 8 to 10 times. And so the argument is, of course, that the implication is that the expense and the costs of Obamacare, so-called, make the program a liability rather than an asset.
Bill, I'm
hello.
Sorry to interrupt, but
that's okay.
We have John on the line for you.
Oh, please. Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank
you. Okay. John. Hello, John. John, are you with us?
I'm working on it. Give me 1 second.
Oh, that's okay. Take your time. That's okay. That's okay. Hello, John.
Bill, I'm sorry. I'm having some phone problems. Let me work on this, and I'll get back to you.
Oh, just get back to me then. Thank you, Agnes.
Thank you.
Okay. So anyway, to go on, and hopefully we'll be able to get John with us in a moment. The fourth item that we dealt with yesterday was, again, focused on the Affordable Care Act and the extent to which, with all of the flap and all of the talk and all of the disruption and conversation about taxation and spending and the increase in healthcare premiums and health insurance premiums and all of that, when all is said and done, this data is presented by Avik Roy to indicate that the number of Americans without health insurance has only gone from 13.9% down to 11.1%. In other words, the total impact of the Affordable Care Act, with all of the discussion, all the verbiage surrounding it, is to reduce those without health insurance by a mere 2.7 percentage points. The implication being, of course, that the end product, given all that went into the Affordable Care Act, the end product was hardly worth the trouble. And of course, what we were talking about yesterday was, in response to this the inference of this particular quotation is is reference to the number of states that refuse to expand Medicare, that basically refuse to expand the opportunity for their own citizens to be able to get health insurance, under the Affordable Care Act, and that with all of the opposition and all of the hostility and all of the roadblocks being put in the way of the Affordable Care Act, one could use the same numbers and argue that a 2.7% decline in the numbers of people without health insurance is indeed a miraculous outcome, given the opposition to the program that has come from so many different sources. And again, I pointed out yesterday, and I think this is significant because it really does run up and down all over me, is the idea that President Obama clearly wanted to compromise with his opponents, with his Republican opponents, by coming up with a health care plan to bring health care to more Americans who didn't have it, and at the same time preserve the idea of the free market by incorporating insurance companies as key players in this particular legislation. In other words, that was a major compromise on the part of the president. And for the private sector, for conservative Republican opponents, to now go around and attack him when he has gone so far, and he left a lot of very progressive supporters on the liberal side speechless, because their preference was universal health care. the idea of taking which Bernie Sanders is talking about now, taking Medicare as a model and making it available to everybody, and just cutting out the private sector totally, cutting out the insurance companies and all the rest of it, and just making the point that people can do what they do in Canada and Great Britain and other places, which is get their health care, go to doctors, go to hospitals, for prescription drugs and various kinds of services, and send the bill to government. And that is the system, the efficient system that many on the far left have wanted for so long. And it seems to me that, and this may be false optimism on my part, but it seems to me that with the persistent opposition to the Affordable Care Act, conservatives might be sorry for what they wish for, because it seems to me that if the Affordable Care Act is ever really eliminated, the pressure for universal health care will be incredibly increased, because millions of Americans who now have health care, however good it is, because of the Affordable Care Act, will suddenly find that coverage ripped out from under them. And so what would have been pressure for universal health care before will be increased by that many people who lose their health insurance should the Affordable Care Act be eliminated. So, that could be a Pyrrhic victory for progressives, and it could be a Pyrrhic victory for conservatives, because in eliminating the Affordable Care Act, they may be making universal health care the only likely option. And personally, I hope indeed that does happen. And then I think the last item we dealt with, which was number 5, was a quotation about Bernie Sanders and the budget that Bernie Sanders is promoting. So let me read this particular quote. This is from Jonah Goldberg. And I'm quite familiar with Jonah Goldberg, who writes for the National Review and has written a number of books on conservative Bill of Rights and strategies to bring free speech for conservatives to what he argues are liberally dominated college campuses and all the rest of it. And Jonah Goldberg writes the following. Bernie Sanders thinks you can pay for an $18 trillion expansion of the welfare state to make it aligned with a Denmark that doesn't actually exist, simply by taxing the billionaire class. There are 536 billionaires in America, says Jonah Goldberg. Even if you confiscated everything they had, which, by the way, would surely destroy the American economy by triggering the greatest round of capital flight in human history and amount to government seizure of countless businesses, it wouldn't come close to covering the cost of Sanders' proposals, unquote. The fact of the matter is, while Bernie Sanders is talking about billionaires and millionaires being required to pay their fair share as a way to fund his proposal for creating 13 million jobs, most of them in revamping our declining, deteriorating infrastructure in our roads, bridges, and various other things. The fact of the matter is, I don't believe Bernie Sanders is talking exclusively about 536 people paying for this. I think what he's talking about is reinstituting the concept of progressive taxation into our income tax system by closing many of the loopholes, not only that these 536 people enjoy, but that a number of other people, including corporate executives and all the rest of it, enjoy as well. It's very obvious that and I think all of us know this, that our tax system is basically favoring those who can afford the kind of legal advice to help them with their taxes in order to find these loopholes. Most of us can't do it. The best most of us can do is go to H&R Block. And of course, what that says, that speaks to, it seems to me, is the incredible complication associated with our income tax system. The fact that millions of people are forced to go to an operation like H&R Block to get their income tax done because they can't even figure out what they owe speaks, it seems to me, to the incredible impact of confusion and unfairness that has been introduced into the tax code by those who not only are seeking loopholes, but are able to afford the kind of legal advice which make it possible for them to find those loopholes. And the rest of us continue to go begging. How many times do we turn on cable television and find these infomercials about these people who claim that if you buy their book, they have found a way to save a fortune by beating Uncle Sam and not working from your own home, being able to garner incomes of several hundred thousands of dollars a week and all the rest of it. And, all of us are confronted by this because all of us know how desperate many of our hardest working people are and how little opportunity they have in our income tax system. So those are the first 5 items on this list of 15 that we began to cover yesterday. And I mentioned that one of the things I hope to accomplish today was to find our way through the other 10. And I'm hoping we'll do that. I reviewed those 10 earlier before we went on the air. Obviously, I've been looking at them off and on all morning. And there are a number of them that, very honestly, I don't really have that much to add, but I think they, they're valuable because they indicate exactly the kinds of things that conservative spokesmen, conservative writers, opinion writers are doing, how they are trying to use data, hard data, numbers, in order to make their case and, according to the title, refute the so-called liberal narrative. And the implication is that all liberals are operating from the same playbook, and it doesn't matter what the issues are, their positions are always the same. And so what this particular article seeks to do is bring quantifiable data to the fore, and that way refute the article, the liberal argument in one area after the other area. I guess the point that I made yesterday is worth repeating, and that is that if you look at all 15 of these items together, it seems to me a valuable use of our time here at the Virtual Center because it's a virtual summary, outline of the conservative agenda, because these are the items of the liberal argument that conservatives believe are most necessary to attack. So it seems to me that, obviously all of us recognize that if you're in any kind of competition, the more you can know about your opponents, the better. It seems to me this article gives us quite a bit of insight into the priorities of progressive opponents, the opponents of progressives. But what I'd like to do, if I could, is share with you another issue that's not necessarily on this list, but it seems to be pretty appropriate based on current events. Most of us are aware that yesterday, President Obama, in an address from the White House, speaking amongst many of those people whose relatives and families have suffered from the violence of guns, from gun violence, he invited to the White House in order to make his point about the executive actions that he intended to take in the last year of his administration, because it was very clear to him that this Congress was not liable or willing to do anything in the area of attacking or challenging the degree of gun violence in America. Many of progressives, many liberals have been for a long time urging the president to do something, and yesterday he announced the ways that he intended to do it. It was a tear-filled presentation. Most of the media basically focused on that, how emotionally involved in this particular issue President Obama was, and how out of character that was for his seemingly impassioned, business-like presentation on so many other issues. This seems to be, in the minds of many people, a little bit out of character for the president. It seems to me that it speaks volumes about how serious he is about this particular issue, and how frustrated, how angry he is because Congress continues to do nothing. And of course, he refers back to the Sandy Hook shooting of all the children that occurred a couple of years ago. And I think what he points out is if Congress didn't do anything then, they're not going to do anything. It doesn't matter how many San Bernardinos we have, or how many Colorados or how many Charleston church shootings we have. It's pretty obvious that if Congress didn't act in response to the Newtown situation, then chances are very, very good that they will not act at all. And that seems to me what prompted the president. And of course, what has happened, as I think all of us recognize and indeed predicted, was that the opposition, the outspoken opposition to the president's actions and to the alleged unconstitutionality of the president's actions was not long in coming. In fact, many of the attacks came before the president even spoke yesterday afternoon. I wanted to share with you the editorial in this morning's New York Times, because they speak to this, and they speak to a few of the major positions taken by Republicans against the president's position, specifically Paul Ryan and Senator Ted Cruz. And so basically the Times make the point and said, on Tuesday in the East Room of the White House, President Obama formally announced that he would be taking a series of executive actions, all of them within his powers as president. It was an important step, the Times said, since he sometimes seems alone in Washington in his willingness to take on the issue of guns. But none of the actions are aimed at taking weapons away from law-abiding citizens, and none will have that effect. In fact, there has been no bill in real contention in Congress for many years that would reduce the number of guns currently in circulation or disarm law-abiding Americans. And yet, as happens every time, the New York Times board says, the response from the anti-regulation crowd, even before the White House said a word in public about Mr. Obama's plans, was to deliberately misstate what Mr. Obama was intending. The president said he wanted to increase the number of government agents to process background checks and make the existing system more effective. He also plans to modestly expand the number of dealers who need federal licenses under current law, and said he would ask Congress for more money to combat mental illness. One of the things that I was struck by, and I don't see reference to it here, but Republican critics have continually addressed the idea that we have enough laws on the books now relating to guns. Why doesn't the administration just enforce those instead of trying to pass new ones? Well, if you look at the president's address yesterday, that's exactly what he's talking about, is making the current laws that are on the books more effective. That's been the allegation against him in the past, but obviously it's that whole argument is being ignored by his critics against what he said yesterday. And here's a quotation from House Speaker Paul Ryan. From day one, the president has never respected the right to safe and legal gun ownership that our nation has valued since its founding. Mr. Ryan said that rather than focus on criminals and terrorists, he goes after the most law-abiding citizens. His words and actions amount to a form of intimidation that undermines liberty, unquote. Ted Cruz of Texas basically goes even further. This is a president, he says, who for 7 years has abused his constitutional authority. We don't beat the bad guys by taking away our guns. We beat the bad guys by using our guns, unquote. And I was struck by that quote from Ted Cruz in light of the article we looked at on Monday by Parker Palmer when he talked about the absurd logic of making a nation which is awash in gun crimes and gun accidental shootings by putting more guns rather than less guns in circulation. So I think both of these speak to the issue. What I wanted to share, and I've had this particular article in my files now for some time because I was waiting for what I thought would be a proper time, an appropriate time to introduce it. And today would seem to be the day, especially since we're taking on some of these holier than thou issues that many conservatives subscribe to, and the issues of gun ownership seems to be one. This is an article which appeared some time ago, and I don't have the date. I neglected when I copied this to put the date of the article when it was printed. But the author of the article is historian Saul Cornell. And just to establish the credibility of Cornell's addressing this issue, let me share with you Saul Cornell's credentials. And again, I looked this up this morning. He is Paul and Diane Gunther Chair in American History at Fordham University. Formerly, he was a professor of history at Ohio State University and served as the former director of the Second Amendment Research Center at the John Glenn Institute at Ohio State. He received his PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania in 1989, and he is considered to be one of the nation's leading authorities on early American constitutional matters. One of the books that he has written, and he has written several, is entitled A Well-Regulated Militia, The Founding Fathers and the Origins of Gun Control in America. He wrote this book in 2006. Let me share with you the title of that book again. A Well-Regulated Militia, The Founding Fathers and the Origins of Gun Control in America. This particular article, which was sent by one of our listeners, it was sent by John, one of our listeners some time ago. This particular article by Saul Cornell, I believe, is incredibly important information in all that we discuss and all that we debate and all that we anticipated associated with the Second Amendment. What Saul Cornell's research is telling us is that the efforts of the Supreme Court, of some members of the Supreme Court, obviously the Scalia, Clarence Thomas group, to extend the Second Amendment's protections to all guns in common use is at odds with history. Cornell points out that today's argument about gun ownership stems from two recent Supreme Court decisions on the matter. And again, I know that those of you who are listening are very, very familiar with at least one of these, which is the Heller decision, the District of Columbia versus Heller, which was a decision the Supreme Court reached in 2007. And then in 2010, in a case called McDonald versus the City of Chicago, the Supreme Court passed those particular or reached those particular majority opinions on the issue of guns. And it's those opinions which establish the idea that the right of individual citizens to own a gun is derived directly from the Second Amendment. In other words, this particular approach, as defined or as focused upon in the Heller decision, pretty well ignores the clause of the Second Amendment related to the idea of the well-regulated militia. It just looks at the second half of the Second Amendment. And you'll remember that the Second Amendment reads that a well-regulated militia being a key to an ordered, secure society, comma, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And basically, the majority in these decisions, the majority of the court, has focused exclusively on the second half of the Second Amendment and totally overlooked or ignored the first one. And what Saul Cornell wants us to note is that since those two decisions were reached in 2007 for Heller, 2010 for McDonald versus Chicago, since that time, the Supreme Court has refused to take under advisement any other Second Amendment case. And what Cornell points out is that Heller and McDonald, those two decisions, when looked at against the history of this issue, those two decisions, Cornell argues, cast aside more than 75 years of established precedent to hold that individual citizens have a right to bear arms for personal use. Cornell says scholars and judges on both the left and the right have attacked those two decisions as being incoherent and historically dishonest. Lower courts have now heard more than 1,000 cases generated by the confusion wrought by the Heller case. Cornell's argument then is that the Heller decision of 2007 is not based on historical precedent, but in fact denies the reality of historical precedent. It flies in the face of history. It ignores the historical record in order to make the decision that the judges wanted, the conservative majority at that time wanted to make. In a sense, then, what Cornell is saying, although he doesn't say this in so many words, is that the conservative majority in Heller is effectively making law. It is denying the reality of historical precedent in order to make or reach the decision that the majority wanted to reach. And in order to do it, they had to ignore or totally violate historical precedent, which basically suggested that they should have ruled in the other direction. This seems to me to be one of the most important concepts in the ongoing debate about gun rights in America. I can't imagine why the administration has not yet adopted and begun to publicize this particular argument. Let me go on and share with you some of the history that Cornell presents. And I ask you to remember his credentials. This guy is an authority on this particular issue. I have not done the work. I have not gone back and looked at the laws that he will refer to in order to validate or verify that what he is saying is true. But given his credentials, I have to believe that his reading of the past is indeed accurate, because that's what he does. Recently, in a case entitled Friedman versus the City of Highland Park, was one of the cases on the Second Amendment that came up recently. At issue was whether the city of Highland Park, Illinois, could maintain a local ordinance banning the possession of military assault rifles and large capacity magazines within city limits. In other words, the issue to come before the court is whether, in fact, the Highland Park law was constitutional. because it seemed to directly contradict the Heller decision. It obviously was there for the court to use the Heller decision to strike down Highland Park's efforts to regulate assault weapons. In April, this past April 2015, the Seventh Circuit Court upheld the Highland Park assault weapons ban, and the case went to the Supreme Court for review. This past October, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. In other words, it let the Highland Park ban on assault weapons stand. Obviously, it was not a unanimous decision. There were two justices that dissented, Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia. In their dissent, they attacked the Seventh Circuit Court's reading of Heller and accused the court majority of attempting to, quote, eviscerate the Second Amendment and consign it to a second-class right. In other words, Scalia and Thomas dissented in the court's refusal to hear the Highland Park case by saying that in letting the Highland Park law stand as constitutional, the court majority was in effect trying to consign the Second Amendment to a second-class right rather than a priority right of all Americans. The Seventh Circuit Court decision upholding the Highland Park law was written by a noted conservative jurist, Judge Frank Easterbrook. So the fact that Thomas and Scalia challenged Easterbrook is significant. Saul Cornell, in his article, then shares with us the basis of the Antonin Scalia, Clarence Thomas dissent. And this is what he says. Thomas and Scalia write that the government is essentially powerless to prohibit or restrict weapons in common use. And that's in quotes. In other words, their argument is based on the idea of common use, that weapons in common use become rights of citizens under the Second Amendment. That's the basis of Scalia and Thomas's dissent in the Friedman versus City of Highland Park case. And this is a quote from their dissent. The right to keep and bear arms is defined not by what the militia needs, but by what private citizens commonly possess. And Saul Cornell calls this their common use formulation. In other words, they are arguing that the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment is driven by common use theory. Whatever weapons are in common use become rights under the Second Amendment. That is what Thomas and Scalia are arguing. Saul Cornell points out that the common use idea, quote, has no foundation in the text, structure, or history of the Second Amendment. In fact, and this Cornell points out, and I think this is an important point, this common use idea gives gun makers, not legislatures, not even courts, but gun makers, the power to determine public policy on guns, which is exactly, Cornell says, why the founders would have spurned it. Think about that, the common use idea. If the right to bear arms is defined by the arms that are in common use, then by definition, gun manufacturers, by flooding the market with a particular weapon, can automatically have it included under the Second Amendment. In reality, then, this is Saul Cornell's point. In reality, then, gun owners are the ones who really control what weapons are covered under the Second Amendment and what aren't by the particular weapons that they manufacture. Saul Cornell goes on and addresses the Scalia-Thomas position even more. Basically, in the Friedman dissent, in their dissent, Thomas and Scalia argue the following, quote, roughly 5 million Americans own assault-style semi-automatic rifles, unquote. Cornell points out that there are 300 million guns in circulation in the United States, meaning that the particular kind of assault weapon that they defend, owned by 5 million Americans, is really only 2% of the number of guns in circulation. That's hardly common. In other words, the amount of assault weapons owned by Americans is less than 2% of the total guns in circulation in this country. So for Scalia and Thomas to argue the common use theory based on that is, Saul Cornell believes, absurd. But this is the heart of this particular article. This is what I think we all need to take from this particular issue. The larger problem, Cornell says, with this market-driven theory of gun policy is that it is opposite to the founders' intent as well as the plain meaning of history. The Second Amendment, Cornell says, was not designed to hobble government regulation. At the time, men arrived for military service already armed with guns that state governments and colonial governments required them to purchase. His point was that in the 17th and 18th century, the guns in common use by most Americans were shotguns to hunt game. They were not muskets available and useful in a military situation. Consequently, states and colonies passed requirements requiring citizens to own muskets in order that they could fulfill their civic obligation to serve in the militia. Consequently, this is the point. Consequently, then, there's a whole history to prove that governments consistently and regularly pass legislation affecting not only who owned guns, who had to own guns, but what kind of guns they were required to own. That doesn't speak to what conservatives are arguing at all. If there's a long, verifiable tradition of states and colonial governments regularly passing legislation requiring citizens to own military-style weapons in order that they could fulfill their responsibilities to serve in militias, then that means that there is an overwhelming amount of historical precedent to support the idea that governments have traditionally regulated gun ownership. And so for Scalia and Thomas and George Will and many of the other people who write on the right to bear arms by suggesting that there is a history to support the idea that governments have never believed that they had the right to regulate gun ownership is out and out lies. It's wrong, Cornell argues. Historical precedent justifies. Traditionally, government's role in regulating not only the responsibility of citizens to own guns, but even dictate the kind of weapons they own. What service could they provide by serving in the militia if they showed up with guns that were only good for hunting turkey and wild game? That wouldn't provide any kind of militia-style security for the citizenry at large. Cornell concludes by saying, in other words, the founders recognized that if left to the free market and people's own preferences, America's militias would be prepared to hunt turkeys, not fight a powerful European standing army. A reliance on the market would have cost America its freedom. The various militia regulations enacted by states in the colonial period and after the adoption of the Second Amendment specified what weapons were required to meet the legal obligation of citizens to serve in the militia. Failing to report to the militia properly armed with the right weapon could result in a fine. If the founders had understood the Second Amendment as Scalia and Thomas suggest it be read, Cornell argues the United States would likely have lost the American Revolution. Let me read that again. If the founders had understood the Second Amendment as Scalia and Thomas suggest it be read, the U.S. would likely have lost the American Revolution. But there's more. If the founders had adopted or supported a common use theory of the Second Amendment, one would have expected that legislatures throughout the country would have carved out some kind of broad immunity protecting ordinary gun possession from the normal and robust regulatory authority of the state. In other words, if what conservatives argue were true, if the Second Amendment was designed to protect everybody's right to own a weapon, then state legislatures would have been passing laws to protect gun ownership from regulation. In fact, Cornell says, the evidence shows that exactly the opposite was true. In nearly every state, legislatures carefully differentiated between militia weapons and personal arms. When early Americans defaulted on debt or fell behind on their taxes, the law exempted their military weapons from seizure. Other weapons, no matter how common they were subject to seizure and being sold to satisfy debts or to pay back taxes. There was never an unlimited right to own whatever guns a person desired. Government traditionally told people what kind of guns they had to own, and if they were sued and required to put up their property for back taxes or for unpaid debts, their military weapons, which the law required them to own, were exempt from confiscation. Again, clear evidence that government traditionally regulated gun ownership, which it seems to me flies in the face of all the arguments that gun rights advocates today claim that history and the founders would have supported the Heller decision. Saul Cornell's evidence suggests that history points out that the founders would have gone crazy if they had seen what the Heller decision was going to allow. And then Cornell points out that after the adoption of the Second Amendment, after 1791, when the Constitution was in place and the Bill of Rights was passed and the Second Amendment was passed, a well-regulated militia being important, etc., etc., the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. In the decades after the Second Amendment was adopted, gun regulations became even more stringent. As guns became cheaper and more reliable, Cornell argues, they posed an even greater threat to public safety. Consequently, the first modern-style gun control laws were passed. Many of these laws were challenged in court, and only in some courts, mainly in the slaveholding South, were these laws struck down. Cornell points out that in his Heller opinion, Scalia ignored the history of those cases that upheld the new gun regulations and focused instead on the few slave state cases that struck them down. In other words, Justice Scalia was cherry-picking the evidence. He was focusing on slave state laws which struck down slave state courts, which struck down government regulations. But what Justice Scalia doesn't mention are the majority of states that upheld in their court decisions the legitimacy of these government regulations. Consequently, it is the Heller decision. It is the idea that every citizen has a right to bear arms under the common use theory that flies in the face of historical precedent. Every piece of evidence suggests, Cornell tells us, that there is a long tradition in this country of the right of government to regulate gun ownership. And for the court, conservatives on the court, to argue today that that history does not exist is fraudulent. It seems to me that this is the best argument we can point to refute the position of gun owners today. I hope that by celebrating the research of Saul Cornell, the administration will be able to substantively support its recent actions announced yesterday by our president on more effective regulations of gun ownership in America. Since, as the president made the comment yesterday, the gun lobby may control Congress, but it shouldn't control the people of the United States. I think this is incredibly important research about a major element in our Constitution, namely the Second Amendment, which has received so much attention and so much focus. Again, going back to the sources, the reading of history, what we've been basically done, we have allowed those who want to argue the right of everyone to bear arms, to own guns. We have relied on their reading of our past in order to claim that they are correct. Cornell's reading of the past, however, finds that there is unlimited and numerous evidence that refutes this particular interpretation of the past. I think it's very significant. I know that we've gone beyond the top of the hour. It's actually 10 minutes into our second hour. It is now 10 minutes after 2 in the East. I'd like to pause and take a 5-minute break, if I could, and then we'll be back and we'll complete our program. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a short 5-minute break, we'll be right back. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour, abbreviated though it is, to our program at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you're just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us throughout the program, I want to thank you for staying with us. And, of course, if you've been with us, you know that we spent the bulk of our first hour addressing not only a review of yesterday's program, but also looking at the issue of gun rights, more specifically the research of Saul Cornell, which basically, I think, refutes with historical evidence the entire basis of the conservative argument that the Second Amendment is intended by the founders to justify the right of every citizen to bear arms, and that it prevents government regulation of guns, of weapons in our society. What Saul Cornell points out is the historical record indicates a long, very prominent situation, historical record, which validates the idea that governments traditionally regulated gun ownership not only before the Constitution of the United States was adopted, but after the Second Amendment, the Bill of Rights, was adopted as well. That there is all sorts of historical evidence to contradict or counteract the Heller decision. What it's going to take, of course, is a Supreme Court comprised of enough justices who are willing to overturn that decision. I find it incredibly significant and ironic that a conservative position argued by conservative justices on the court would undertake a form of judicial activism like this. This obviously indicates, the Heller decision in 2007 indicates that a conservative majority on the court chose to ignore the historical record, to ignore historical precedent, and replace it with their own preferred reading of the Second Amendment in order to implement the idea as indicated in Heller, the idea that gun ownership is a right of all under the Second Amendment. It is very obvious that the court's reluctance to hear follow-up cases on the Second Amendment indicates that, in effect, the court majority today is unwilling to use Heller in order to strike down laws like the Highland Park law regulating assault weapons. It clearly indicates, it seems to me, that the court majority today is primed to overturn Heller. I say that because if inclined the other way, the court majority would have accepted these cases and would have used Heller to strike down these local examples of efforts to regulate guns. But the court has consistently, over and over again, refused to do that. So I think that there is, at least in the offing, an indication that the court is moving in a direction opposite to the priorities of Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas. That basically, I think, was the significance of our first half of today's program. So again, I want to welcome all of you who are just joining us, or those of you who've been with us through the whole program. I want to make you aware that we do have a phone number, and that number will get you on the air. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-HORN. If you'd like to email me directly, one-on-one, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W.A. O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, lowercase, all one word, W.A. O'Brien, 906, at gmail.com. And again, I also invite you to visit our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the study of the Constitution, and you will gain access to our Facebook page, and you can, by all means, choose to call in and react to what's on that Facebook page, or you can send me an email, or you can appropriately comment in places invited for such purposes on Facebook. I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to hearing from you if you do indeed choose to call. I think that our first hour today is one of the most significant segments of the Virtual Center that we've had in some time. And again, let me just share with you the title of Saul Cornell's 2006 books, A Well-Regulated Militia, The Founding Fathers and the Origins of Gun Control in America, 2006. I am suggesting, this is the year before the Heller decision, I am guessing, I have not read that book, but I am guessing that this particular book contains the historical evidence that Saul Cornell implies that he has when he wrote this particular article on gun regulation, on the tradition and the history of gun regulation, and his point that not only would the founders have not supported the Heller decision, they would have screamed in opposition. The history then does not support the position or the direction that the conservative majority chose to take the nation in 2007. And I think, again, this speaks to the whole idea of allowing others to interpret the past for us, as opposed to our willingness to interpret it for ourselves. I know it takes time. I know it's inconvenient, but it is so important. And it seems to me what we are seeing since we've been doing these programs at the Virtual Center is that over and over again, the historical record seems to contradict those whose political and ideological agenda has caused folks to find in the past the historical tradition they wanted to find. In other words, we are finding on this issue, as well as others, the inclination to cherry pick the past in order to make it support a particular political agenda in the present. I think that's very evident in the 15 items that we have begun to address in the piece that we began to take on yesterday. And I'm basically searching for that particular piece. If you'll bear with me. I had it and I laid it somewhere. I tend to pace around here, and I feel like I must have laid it down in a place that I can't seem to lay my hands on it. Here it is. Here it is. We went through the first 5 items on this list of 15, and I wanted to use the rest of our program today, and we have about 40 minutes left in our program. It's well, actually a little bit less than that. It's 23 minutes after the hour, so we've got about a half hour, it seems to me, that we can devote to these particular issues. We looked at the first 5. We saw that 2 of them addressed the issue of Obamacare. One of them addressed the issue of inequality in American society by looking at the Bernie Sanders quote. Another addressed the issue of the extent to which terrorism and Islam go hand in hand. And we looked at the issue, one of them dealt with the issue of racism. Pretty good summary so far, it seems to me, of what we would call a litany of conservative priorities in today's conservative political world. Here's number 6. This is from Ann Coulter. Quote, in 2010, 38,329 people died from drug overdoses, twice the number a decade earlier. More people died of drug overdoses than from automobile accidents, 30,196, murders, 13,000, or gun accidents, 700. So said Ann Coulter. Her data, of course, is from 2010. And I think the issue here, which is an obvious one, is that something that we've all come to realize since this data was generated in 2010, namely that the issue of drug overdoses and the number of people who are dying from drug overdoses and the abuse of prescription drugs, which is not included in this particular quote, but it well could be, that this is an issue in our society which she argues is actually more significant than automobile deaths, murders, or gun accidents. I would suggest to you that there's a social and economic note to this particular data. In other words, if you take the data at face value, then what Ann Coulter is arguing is that the issue of drugs should be the focus of our attention, not gun regulation, not any of these other things. There's no question that the issue of drug abuse and the number of deaths from it is a class issue. It basically suggests that this major problem in America's contemporary lifestyle is a problem which is particularly pertinent among poorer, underemployed, or unemployed populations. I think that says a lot. The implication is that the major problem that she identifies by the numbers, which is drug overdose, is much more affecting a particular element of our society than the entire society. I would argue that since 2010, that data has only increased. And one of the things we've begun to realize, and I've seen other data, more recent data to indicate this, is that this particular issue, while it continues to be a problem among our unemployed and underemployed peoples, is also, thinking specifically of cocaine, is specifically a problem of our middle and upper classes as well. But again, I think we need to take the issue for what it's worth. But that's number 6. Number 7 is data from Ruth Douthat, who is the conservative columnist for the New York Times. And this is a quote. Between 1979 and 2010, and so what we're talking about is the last 30 years, so-called, up to 2010. For instance, the average after-tax income for the poorest quintile of American households rose from $14,800 per year to $19,200 per year. In other words, an increase of $5,800 a year between 79 and 2010. So over the last 30 years, the annual income for our poorest households has increased almost $6,000 in 30 years. For the second poorest quintile, in other words, the second poorest 20% of our population, it rose from $29,900 to $39,100. In other words, more than $10,000 per household for the second lowest quintile on the income scale. Meanwhile, Douthat says, per person anti-poverty spending at the state and federal level increased sixfold between 1968 and 2008. and that excludes Medicare, unemployment benefits, and Social Security, unquote. The message that Douthart hopes this data will send to us is clear. The implication is that over the last 30 years or 35 years or whatever, the income of our poorest households has been increasing significantly, yet the expense associated with anti-poverty programs continues to escalate at a rate far greater than that. In other words, Douthart's message is that in spite of noble efforts to increase the household income of our poorest people, the increase in government spending on anti-poverty programs is out of control. I don't think there's any question as to what the message is here. That our priorities as a nation are misspent, are misdirected, he is saying. That we are doing all we can for our poorest people, but that they are demanding more, and we are delivering more. And the implication is that it's breaking the bank. So obviously, what this data is intended to suggest to the reader is that we should redirect our efforts from what we're doing. That our efforts to continually expand anti-poverty spending flies in the face of the fact that many of these people are already experiencing increases in family income, in household income. I think there's a lot of sociological and economic data that one could bring to the fore to challenge the implications of Douthart's message here. Obviously, it seems to me, over a 30-year period, all of us are spending. Many of us are trying to maintain households. Many of us are seeing the costs of living go up and up and up faster than many of us can adjust to, especially those of us who might be on fixed incomes. The cost of everything goes up, with the recent exception, of course, of gasoline. And this has been almost like a pay raise for working people. And the estimates are that over the past year, the average family has saved about $500 in expenses usually paid to put gasoline in our trucks and in our automobiles. But with the exception of that, the implication is that we're doing pretty well. I would ask you to look at the numbers. 14,008 to 19,2. 29,9 to 39,1. I would argue that the lowest quintile, 14,8 to 19,2, to support a family on less than $20,000 a year in today's economy is pretty difficult. The next lowest quintile, which is 29,9 to 39,1, $39,000 annual income per household, suggests problems as well, given the increase in college tuitions and all the rest of it. One must assume that the second lowest quintile would be an element of our society that would look toward college education for the younger people, for the young people. College education in today's world on a $39,000 income, it seems to me, is going to be very, very difficult. So I would suggest to you that the increase in anti-tax spending that we've seen probably speaks to the escalating cost of living that all of us confront as much as anything else. And again, you have to weigh that against the incredible incomes and the incredible amount of wealth that's being accumulated amongst the so-called 1% or the upper 10%, let's put it that way. And as Bernie Sanders has been telling us, the income of the upper 10% of our society equals the remaining 90% shared amongst all the others. So it seems to me that while the data looks impressive on the surface, when you begin to examine it in light of the world we live in, you can begin to see some of the prejudices and some of the priorities that are indicated within the presentation of this particular data. Number 8, Mark Krikorian again. Just last month, the Senate Judiciary Committee received a report that in just 4 years, 121 illegal aliens who had been released by ICE went on to murder Americans, unquote. I think the message there is quite clear. By suggesting that over the last 4 years, 121 murders of Americans by illegal aliens has taken place. The message is clear. We've got to get illegal aliens out of this country. The implication is that the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of aliens coming into the country illegally as well as legally are potential criminals. When you look at, it's the same as the first item that, interestingly enough, Mark Krikorian presented as well. Namely, the issue of terrorism and Muslims. Muslims comprise less than 1% of the population, but they commit half of the terrorist acts within the United States. Now we're looking at murders, 121 murders by illegal aliens over the last 4 years. The message is clear. Get illegal aliens out of this country. Donald Trump, deport them. And again, it seems to me when you look at the support that Donald Trump is receiving in this presidential campaign, there are a lot of people, relatively speaking, because I don't believe there are a lot, but in light of the Republican primaries, there is a significant element within the Republican voting population that endorses Trump's idea of building a wall and getting aliens out of the country, getting Muslims out of the country. In other words, building a wall around America. The old idea of Fortress America, withdrawing from the world, going against all the traditions on which this nation was based. And I think this is the kind of data that supporters of those actions will naturally conjure up in order to make the point that we will be safer and more secure if we get Muslims out of here, if we get illegal aliens out of here, if we basically leave the nation for the rest of us. And of course, when we look at the situation that's going on in Oregon right now, in the occupation of federal property in Oregon, and you look at some of the skinhead violence and all the rest of it, the right-wing Nazi-type violence that's happening in the country, I would suggest that these solutions, while they sound good, are not getting all the people off the streets that need to be addressed. But I think those are particularly telling pieces of information. The following is information. This is number 9. It's presented by Jason Riley, and it deals with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the so-called SNAP program. Officially known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, the food stamp program has become the country's fastest growing means-tested social welfare program. Only Medicaid is more expensive. Between 2000 and 2013, SNAP caseloads grew to 47.6 million from 17.2 million. the number of people on food stamps between 2000 and 2013 increased from 17.2 million to 47.6 million. And spending grew to $80 billion from $20.6 billion, according to the Agriculture Department. SNAP participation fell slightly last year to 46.5 million individuals as the economy improved. But that still leaves a population the size of Spain's living in the United States on food stamps. I guess the question that I would ask here is this a condemnation of the people who are on food stamps, or is this an attack on an economy which is able to contain or withstand 47? What again is the number? 47 million people in a population of 300 million. Obviously, it's over that. But 47 million, 47.6 million in a population of 300 million is 1/6 of our population on food stamps. Here in West Virginia, we've learned that more than half of all the children attending public schools in the state of West Virginia qualify for assistance, for paid lunches. So again, is this the criticism of the takers, or is this a criticism of a society where wealth and income is so inequitably distributed that 1/6 of the population qualifies for food stamps? I would suggest to you that this is more a criticism of the economy and those who manage it than it is on the people who qualify for public assistance within that economy. But again, I think it's quite significant. The next item, number 10, deals with our prison populations and our effort to try to reduce the size of those people in this nation who are incarcerated. And we know that they are overwhelmingly African American. And we know also that proportionally speaking, we have more incarcerated Americans than any other developed nation in the world by far. We're locking up our people at rates that are absolutely incredible. Much of it for political reasons, as we know. Many states who fell under the control of conservative voters passed mandatory sentencing legislation, which took the prerogative away from judges of assessing penalties for crimes as well as for misdemeanors. In other words, the legislatures, conservative legislatures, took the interpretation of law and the assessment of punishments out of the hands of the courts and delivered that power into legislature, into lawmaking bodies. And I think we've seen the results. Our prisons are exploding. Our jails are exploding. The costs of incarcerating Americans is seemingly incredible. Let's look at this particular quote on some of the data. This is from Heather McDonald, who obviously collects this kind of data. The state prison population, which accounts for 87% of the nation's prisoners. Now, we're talking about state prisons here, not federal prisons, not yet. The state prison population, which is 80% of the nation's prisoners, is dominated by violent criminals and serial thieves. In 2013, drug offenders made up less than 16% of the state prison population. Violent felons were 54%, property offenders 19%. Reducing drug-related admissions to 15 large state penitentiaries by half would lower those state prison count by only 7%, according to the Urban Institute. The message here is that we are on the wrong track if we think we are going to reduce our prison populations by minimizing or reducing the numbers of people incarcerated for nonviolent drug-related offenses, which seems to be the priority agenda at the current time. Heather McDonald's research indicates that in state prisons, which is 80% of the prison population in the country, the percentage of those who are incarcerated for nonviolent drug-related admissions is quite low. And if we were to cut that population by half, that would only lower our prison populations by 7% in our state prisons. So her suggestion is that we need to continue to look for the reason that we are incarcerating so many. And it seems to me one of the conclusions that one reaches is there anything about living in this country that produces more violent criminals than any other place in the world? I'm kind of thinking of the situation that we talked about earlier in today's program about gun ownership. Anyway, to federal prisons. In federal prisons, she points out, which hold only 13% of the nation's prisoners, I think this is significant. 87% of those in prisons are in state prisons, local jails, etc. Only 13% are in federal prisons. But in those federal prisons, drug offenders make up half of the population. So if one is going to significantly reduce the prison population in this country by minimizing incarceration for drug-related offenses, then it's going to happen in federal prisons, not state prisons. And since federal prisons only house 13% of our total prison population, her suggestion is this isn't going to cut it. This isn't the way to a solution. But she also points out that while half of the prison population in federal prisons are in there for drug-related offenses, she points out that these offenders are not your casual drug users. Overwhelmingly, they are serious traffickers. Fewer than 1% of drug offenders sentenced in federal court in 2014 were convicted of simple drug possession, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission. Most of those possession convictions were plea bargained down from trafficking charges, she points out. Her suggestion is then that our efforts to try to reform our strategies in terms of our prison populations needs to deal with the realities of the populations itself. 87% of them are on the state level. But I would suggest to you it's on that level where the mandatory sentencing happens. And given the nation's overwhelming concern about security and about crime and about break-ins, just look at the growth of the industry, the home security industry, and I think you get a sense as to how concerned people are about safety and security and crime. Break-ins, carjackings, and all the rest of it. So given the nation's concern then, it stands to reason that legislatures would come down hard on mandatory sentencing for certain crimes. That's the way to get elected. If you promise the voters that you'll be tough on crime, that's the way you win elections. So for political reasons, as much as anything, states have adopted minimum sentencing requirements for particular crimes. And the initiative or the ability to interpret crimes based on the laws that they violate have been taken out of the hands of our judges That's where the expertise is. I think that we've gotten ourselves into this overcrowded prison situation for political reasons as much as anything else. There's been a concerted effort to frighten the American people and then to run for political elections by promising the voters that if I'm elected, I will come down hard on criminals. And we're paying the result, namely the costs of supporting an incredibly large prison population, the majority of whom are African American. This raises serious questions about whether, in fact, the race issue, and I think back to one of our earlier points here, that the issue of race is not part of what defines the United States in today's world. I would suggest if you look at our prison population, it suggests that our prison rates have replaced segregation and the institution of slavery itself as society's ways to deal with significant African American minorities. So, in effect, we really haven't solved the race issue at all. I would suggest that overcrowded prisons is not indeed a solution to that problem. Point number 11, we've got less than 10 minutes left in our program, so I'd like to move through these as quickly as I can. Number 11, the Conservative Heritage Foundation estimates unlawful immigrant households paid $39.2 billion in taxes in 2010, received $93.7 billion in government services. In other words, the argument is that we are basically spending public taxpayer money for unlawful immigrant households at a rate far in excess of what these households contribute to our overall economy. Unlawful immigrant households paid $39.2 billion in taxes, yet they received 3 times that in services. Again, the message is clear. The implication of the author is obvious as to what we must do. This one deals with gun violence. Number 12. On Wednesday, a Washington Post article announced that the San Bernardino shooting is the second mass shooting today and the 355th this year. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow, as an example, and many other places pointed to similar statistics. Grim details from the church in Charleston, a college classroom in Oregon, and a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado are still fresh in our minds. The point is that in focusing on these, you miss more than 300 other such attacks in 2015 alone. This particular piece of data from Mark Folman at Mother Jones Magazine suggests 3 decades of mass public shootings. And so again, he points out in this data that all of it depends on how you define mass public shootings. Obviously, when they're committed by Muslims, we call them terrorists. When they're not committed by Muslims, we call them mass shootings and crimes by deranged individuals, mentally ill people, etc., etc., etc. Number 13. As Pew Research reports, previous immigrants, this is, I think, interesting. Previous immigrants were almost entirely European. For years, most of the immigrant population coming into this country legally was from Europe. But since President Kennedy's Immigration Act, a majority of immigrants have been from Latin America. 1/4 are from Asia. Only 12% of post-1965 immigrants have been from Europe, and they're probably Muslims. Conclusion? Apparently, the American experiment is actually some kind of sociological trial to see if people who have no history of Western government can run a constitutional republic. As of 1970, there were only 9 million Hispanics in the entire country, according to Pew Research. Today, there were well over 60 million. Ann Coulter. The issue, her point is that we were not in any trouble at all as long as most of our immigrant population was coming from Europe. But the minute it started to come from elsewhere in the world, we started to get in trouble. What does this tell you about elements of racism and bigotry and all the rest of it? I just don't think that there's any further comment necessary. Number 14, no fewer than 8 major studies from around the world have found homosexuality to not be a genetic condition. And this is, as you know, is tied with the conservative idea that homosexuality is a lifestyle choice. Peter Sprigg of the Family Research Council, and we all know the Family Research Council, says that these numerous rigorous studies of identical twins have now made it impossible to argue that there's a gay gene. If homosexuality were inborn and predetermined, then when one identical twin is homosexual, the other one would be as well. Yet one study from Yale and another from Columbia indicate that homosexuality common to only 6.7% of male identical twins and 5.3% of female identical twins. The implication is that homosexuality is learned behavior, not genetic in its origin. And of course, this is the traditional argument that conservatives have used about the research on identical twins. And again, I think this gets into an element of research here that I'm not that comfortable with. But I think you get the message, and I think you get the idea. And let me share with you the last one, number 15, as we move toward the end of our program. It's now 56 minutes after the hour, so we've got about a minute and a half. Over the last year, only 1.3 million Americans of working age have entered the workforce, even as the population of the same demographic increased by more than 2.8 million. So what does that say? It says that over the last year, the population of work-eligible people in this country was 2.8 million. Only 1.3 million of them have entered the workforce. Just over 1 million members of this group found jobs. The implication then, the data suggests that less than 4 in 10 found jobs. Is that a criticism of people not wanting to work? Or is that a criticism of the economy, which is increasingly driving meaningful, well-paying jobs elsewhere for tax purposes? I think that's one that we spent a lot of time on before. We're now at 58 minutes after the hour. I think it's time we wound up. I want to thank you so much for tuning in once again to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We won't be back again until this coming Monday, as you know. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your continued support of this program and your continuing support of the Head On Radio Network. Please be kind to each other. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to getting together again with you here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you so much for your attention and for your willingness to continually tune in to the Virtual Center. It means a lot to me, and I hope that these programs mean a lot to you as well. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very, very much.